3 in Chapter 9. Women Alone, Halloween Night. Transcript of live feed interview, WPIV Channel 5 Action News. Reporter: This is Jade Wells reporting live from the steps of Wendell's City Hall, where final preparations began early this morning and will continue throughout the day for tonight's King Forest Parade. I'm joined right now by Wendell's Mayor, Alfonso Del Olio. Mayor, you expect quite a few spectators to your town this evening, don't you? Mayor: That's right, Jade. Each year, over 20,000 folks from throughout the country come out for the parade. It's a tradition we've kept going for over 60 years. In fact, I remember marching in the parade when I was just this high. Reporter: Well, WPIV's weatherman is calling for clear skies through the weekend, so it looks like you'll have a beautiful night for it. Mayor: Absolutely. Tonight we welcome in Old Man Winter, or as he's known locally, King Frost. So I invite everyone, young and old, to come out in costume tonight and enjoy the last outdoor blast for the season. Reporter: Mayor, there are some who are criticizing your decision to hold the parade in light of recent alarming events in Wendell, the disappearance of several Danfield College students and other residents, as well as one unsolved homicide. Do you care to comment? Mayor: Those are isolated incidents of an unfortunate nature and are still under investigation. But I will say that Wendell always has been and will continue to be a safe place for children, parents, families, everyone, except witches, of course. He removes a tall black witch's cap from off screen and puts it on the reporter's head. Reporter: So what you think my chances are of winning best costume? Mayor: I don't know, Jade. There's going to be tough competition in your age group. Maybe if we enter you under the category of prettiest news witch. Reporter: Well, there you have it, folks. Down here, spending a few hours with the ghouls and ghosts of Wendell, this is Jade Wells reporting live for Action News. Chapter 9. The pregnant woman, Karen Glazer, 38-year-old white female just entering her third trimester, spent the pre-dawn hours of Halloween morning in the emergency room, being poked and prodded and generally frowned over by the exhausted house staff. They replaced the blood she'd lost, noted that she was 2 centimeters dilated, monitored the baby's fetal heartbeat, still strong, and paged her OB-GYN. Throughout the ordeal, the patient floated in and out of consciousness, mumbling with only occasional coherence about someone named Paul, her husband it was presumed, who had disappeared, about monsters trying to steal her baby, and about a hole in the roof. The trauma staff pulled a blood sample for a toxicology screen, and while it was processed by the lab, took bets among themselves on what cocktail of narcotics she'd ingested. They examined the deep ligature marks on the patient's neck and concocted their own cynical backstory of domestic violence and addiction. When the tox screen came back clean, the chief resident on duty scowled. "Impossible," he said with authority, and turned to the nearest RN. "Pull another 2 vials. Fucking lab techs must be smoking their Halloween crack." Then he promptly forgot about the pregnant head case and trauma room, as he looked up at the sound of the automatic doors shushing open for his next customer, a townie cop bleeding from a scalp lack that looked like it wanted stitches. "What the hell happened to you, officer?" the resident asked. The sheriff shot him a warning look and simply said, "Gallows." Wendy sat huddled in the wicker chair by her bedroom window. She had slept fitfully through the night, for once more afraid of the dawn than of dreaming. She pulled her flannel robe tight, hugged herself, but could not banish the unnatural chill she felt. A cup of hot chocolate might have done the trick, she thought as she watched the sun climb over the trees. But she was imprisoned by the notion that if she left her room, even for a moment, the spell would be broken. Dream would become reality, and she could not bear that. Soon enough she heard a quick rapping on her door. "Come in," she said, her voice quiet with resignation. Her father opened the door and walked over to her, his expression grim. "Wendy," he said, "there's been an accident at Marshall Field." She looked up at him, her lips pressed together to quell their trembling. Her voice would betray her if she spoke. Her father's concerned face blurred before her as tears welled in her eyes. She wiped them quickly, pretended it was only sleep there. Only divination or uncanny premonition could account for what she knew, had known since late the previous evening. "Come downstairs," he said. "It's on television." She nodded, stood up, and suddenly wrapped her arms around him. "Love you, Dad," she said, her voice a strangled whisper. He patted her back, stroked her hair, his own voice lost. "It's about Alex," she said, her voice firm now, but still only a contained whisper, enough to dam the flood of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Isn't it?" "I'm afraid so. It looks bad." Elizabeth Wither stares defiantly at the hardened faces of the people gathered in the commons. She stands on a wobbly platform, Sarah and Rebecca on either side of her, too far away to touch even if her hands were not bound. A noose around their necks connect each of them to the rough-hewn timber above. The knot bites into Wither's flesh. The executioner moves down the line and kicks the platform out from under each of them. Wither feels the sharp pull of gravity under her body, until her body jerks at the end of the suddenly taut rope. The crowd gasps. Wither cannot breathe. Her eyes roll back into her head, and she lets the darkness consume her. The sensation of falling caused Wendy to stagger into her father, who caught her elbows. She nodded at him that she was okay, but the long walk down to the family room was a blur forever lost to memory. Her legs were numb, her arms superfluous as she allowed her father to guide her all the way. She chewed her lower lip to hold back a wail that seemed to swirl inside her heart, battering her body like a ship on a storm-tossed sea, seeking escape. Her mother stood in the family room with her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, brimming with tears when she saw Wendy enter the room. Wendy choked back a sob, her mother's reaction releasing a force within her. On the big screen television and on the scene reporter stood almost life-size near the fence at Marshall Field. In the background, Wendy saw the twisted, mangled wreck of the home team bleachers. As a freak accident, it is unknown at this time why the Danfield freshman was under the bleachers when they collapsed, although friends say he was in the habit of running on the abandoned track here. This is Michelle Lundquist reporting live for WTKN News 9. The station cut to the news anchor. "Thank you, Michelle," he said, turning away from his off-screen monitor to face the live camera. Again, this was the scene last night after police received calls from a student in a nearby dorm who described what sounded like a series of explosions. Video footage replaced the anchorman. Marshall Field again, cloaked in night, the two security lights at either end of the field, barely enough to illuminate the field. In the foreground, a police cruiser with flashing red lights and an ambulance, also flashing lights as attendants hurried a collapsible stretcher into the back. Wendy caught a fleeting glimpse of a bloodied face a moment before the EMTs slammed the ambulance door shut. The ambulance drove off, sirens screaming. Cut back to the anchorman. Police are attributing the collapse of the bleachers to extreme metal fatigue, but there was clear evidence of vandalism to many of the benches. If other students were involved, their identities are not known at this time. Police are looking into the possibility of a fraternity prank gone awry. Again, the Danfield freshman suffered broken bones, internal injuries, and some head trauma. Police have notified the family of the student, who has been identified as Alexander Dunkirk of Minneapolis. He was admitted to Wendell General and remains in critical condition. Wendy crumpled at the mention of his name, sobbing. But he was still alive. She had been so sure he was dead. Her father supported her with one arm around her waist and led her to the sofa. She covered her mouth but made no effort to stop the silent tears streaming down her cheeks, and she choked. Her mother took her other hand, pressed it within hers. "Wendy, dear, I know this is hard, but we need to ask you something." Wendy nodded. Her mother looked to her father for help. He cleared his throat. "The press called," he said. "They want an official statement from me." Again, Wendy simply nodded. "Honey," her mother said, "I left you with Alex last night. Do you know anything about what happened to him?" That was the question Wendy prayed her mother would not ask. How could she ever answer that? "We went out for a while," Wendy said, finally wiping tears from her cheeks. "To Marshall Field?" her father asked. She shook her head vigorously. "No," she said. "We went for a drive. We came back here, but he left around 11. Said he was going back to his dorm." Her father sat down beside her, stroked her hair again. "We'll take you to see him later. I don't want you driving just yet." Wendy buried her face in her mother's blouse and let herself cry. She hadn't realized just how much Alex meant to her. How could she tell them that she felt responsible for his accident? She was overcome with waves of guilt and relief in equal measure. "You'll be fine," she had told him, "and now this. But thank God you're alive." She visited his bedside for only a few moments, which was all his doctor would allow and was almost more than she could bear. They had stopped the internal bleeding, bandaged his head, and put casts on both legs and his left arm. He was hooked up to an IV and had an oxygen tube up his nose. His face was a frightful study in contusions and abrasions. He was so pale from loss of blood, but his condition had been downgraded to serious. He still had not regained consciousness. Before she left his side, she squeezed his right hand, whispered fiercely, "I'm so sorry, Alex." She kissed him lightly on the cheek. Then she placed the cloth-wrapped mandrake root under his pillow. Maybe the nurses, seeing it could do no harm, would actually leave it there. After Wendy returned home from the hospital with her parents, she was still so distraught her mother gave her one of her machine-manufactured sedatives, which Wendy swallowed without a single protest, and it took the harsh edges off of jagged reality. Exhausted and sedated, she fell asleep on the sofa. Before her father spoke with the press, he carried her up to her bedroom, placed her gently on her bed, then stood back as her mother placed a comforter over her. As he stood looking at his daughter's tear-reddened face, Larry Ward couldn't help but notice all the strands of gray hair around her temples. "Karen?" a voice asked quietly, and she opened her eyes to see Maria Labajo looking down on her. It was late morning, and Karen was resting with eyes closed in the private room of the maternity ward to which she'd been relocated, as she waited out the regular Braxton Hicks contractions of early labor. The overworked ER trauma staff had been unable to reach Maria throughout the morning, and had finally tracked her down to the Copley Square Marriott in Boston, where the obstetrician had been attending a medical conference on alternatives to hysterectomy. Maria checked Karen's pulse now at the wet wrist, then held her patient's hand in her own. "Honey, I'm so sorry about Paul," Maria said. The sight of tears spilling down Karen's cheeks brought tears to Maria's own eyes, and for the moment she put aside the clinical stoicism she typically held as a protective shield against her patient's sorrow. "They told me they'd informed you how he was found." "Yes," Karen said miserably. When she'd been told an hour earlier, the news had come as neither as a surprise nor a shock, but only a confirmation of what she'd dreaded. She'd known he was dead the moment he went out the bedroom window. Only the circumstances of his death were new. He died defending her, defending their baby, and for that she would love him always, and fiercely. Already, though, she felt the merciless erosion of memory, that self-protecting healing instinct that begins to blur the face of our beloved the instant they slip from us. She couldn't bear it, and so she turned her attention willfully away from its own dissolution and asked Maria, "Is the baby coming?" Maria looked at her with concern. "Slowly. You're dilating at less than a quarter centimeter per hour, and the baby's hardly descended at all. At this rate, you'll remain in prolonged latency for another 12 hours. A male RN arrived with an IV bag of medication. "I'll take that," Maria told him, and connected the bag to an intravenous infusion pump. She connected it to the IV line, already dripping hydrating fluids into Karen's arm. "This is synthetic oxytocin to speed up the labor," Maria said. "The contractions may be a little more painful, so let me know if you're hurting too much and we'll see about getting you some mepridine. The important thing now is to get you through this as quickly as possible and without a C-section, if it can be avoided." "What about the baby?" Karen asked. "Is her heartbeat still strong? Will she survive the birth?" Maria heard the hope in her patient's voice and knew in this rare case she should caution against it. "Maybe, but you need to prepare yourself that she probably won't survive the night. Frankly, I'm amazed the baby has survived this long." Whatever genetic defect is at work here has kicked her gestational rate into high gear. She's already the size of a healthy 37-week-old. Healthy? Karen said, clinging to hope. Maria took her hand and gave it a squeeze, looked at her patient sadly. I'm sorry, Karen. Art learned about his brother's death on the noon news. He was holed up in the old vinyl archives of the WDAN campus radio station, where he'd come on foot last night after ditching Karen's Volvo. He received the news in stunned silence on a little black and white portable TV he'd found among the junk of the back room. From its staticky screen, he also learned that his own fugitive status had reached critical mass during the night, following his assault on Wendell's sheriff, his suspected abduction of 8-year-old Abby McNeil, and brutal murder of her father in the hospital chapel. Though not armed, the news anchor warned Art Leeson should be considered very dangerous. Art didn't feel very dangerous. All he felt was miserable, squatting in a corner of a windowless back room that smelled of deteriorating cardboard and rotten carpet padding. He wept loudly for his brother, confident he was buried deep enough in the cinder block bunker that he wouldn't be discovered by the daytime student DJs. Half of WDAN's back rooms were virtually inaccessible, the doors barricaded with collapsed metal shelves of archaic equipment and old record promos. Art cowered in the most remote one, wishing he could somehow stay here eternally and join the other obsolete junk, the 8-tracks and unspooling reel-to-reels, moldering quietly in darkness. He tried to distract himself from the sorrow with questions. What had Paul been doing on a water tower? What had happened to the roof of Karen's house? Where was Abby? And what was this goddamn curse that had chosen Art and anyone with whom he came in contact for its victims? He drew his knees up beneath his chin and huddled in darkness through the long afternoon, with only questions for company. In anticipation of the parade, most downtown employers released their office workers at 3:30 that afternoon. Sidewalk cafes and lunch counters closed early. Most would convert to food concessions later, serving everything from fried dough to lobster rolls, while the boutiques along Main Street and College Avenue moved their prettiest wares into storefront displays, tricked out into autumnal splendor. Though there would be no sales this evening, by official decree, most retailers took consolation in the fact that King Frost, by enticing 20,000 out-of-towners to Wendell's sidewalks, offered the year's biggest night of free advertising. By 4, deputies Jeff Schaefer and Reed Davis began rerouting traffic around the central business district, while volunteers from Wendell's Lone Engine and Ladder Company set up barricades and hand-painted signs in the 4 large municipal lots designated for festival parking. Parking alone was expected to generate in excess of $50,000 in revenue. Meanwhile, at the pavilion outside of the Danville College gates, which also fronted the square, students from the school's sound technology department were laying cable and tweaking audio levels in preparation for a 5 o'clock sound check. After heated competition, several local bands had been awarded the coveted 30-minute sets scheduled throughout the evening. Showcasing a representative section of musical tastes, the evening lineup included such perennials of the Essex Tavern circuit as George Fatback Johnson, Chicago Blues, Tyrannosaurus Sex, Ska, Margot Rita, Jimmy Buffett covers, DK, Goth, Tackhammer, Indie, Grim Reaper, Metal, and the bizarre acoustic quartet Bob and Ted and Carol and Malice, Folk. 5 on the dot. The bass-heavy power chords of sound check carried on the clear night, and could be heard as far away as the outlying residential neighborhoods of Wendell, where the first trick-or-treaters were emerging. The bass gave the night an ominous pulse, an anticipatory heartbeat. In the neighborhoods, parents accompanying their little flame-retardant ghouls and drugstore goblins, not to mention Spice Girls, looked up at the sound of distant rumbling. Could that be thunder? But no. One look at the twilit sky dispelled that question. It was that moment of an autumn sunset when lawns glow blue-green and the air turns the color of gasoline. The sky was untroubled except for the bellwether clouds that reached high, smoky fingers from the west. The air was hushed. King Frost was coming. At that very instant downtown, strings of white festival lights and decorative orange paper lanterns twinkled on as Mayor Alphonse del Olio threw a ceremonial switch. Behind him, arranged on the steps of City Hall, the Harrison High School marching band began playing. The 65th annual King Frost Halloween Parade had begun. Halloween was here. Matthias had more foul work to do, even though the eve had arrived. Cleaning up after the witches, burying the scraps of flesh and bone they discarded, burning the clothes of any personal effects left over after their feeding. He'd have to go into the barn to remove the latest steaming carcass or two before the stench of rot became too powerful. One time he'd had to tie a rag dipped in kerosene around his face to combat the putrid odor of a long-gone corpse. He still remembered the time, years before that, when he'd gone in without any special preparation and heaved up his morning meal to the cackling amusement of the witches. This time, however, he wouldn't mind venturing into the barn, for the need was upon him again, as it came every month when the moon was heavy and bloated in the sky. It sickened him, his craving, but there was naught to do for it. By the time the moon was full, he'd walk through a sea of bloated corpses to have his need attended by Wither or one of the others. As loathsome as the craving was, to deny it was 1,000 times worse. One time, 60 years ago or more, when the witches were lethargic and barely noticed him, he had tried to stay away, to wait through the cycle of the moon, to free himself from their hold. Wasn't long before he couldn't keep down solid food, and not much longer after that when a mere glass of water triggered retching spells so violent he would black out from the coughing. He had crawled, squirmed almost, all the long way to the barn and had almost died with the effort of getting the doors open just wide enough for him to squeeze through. They made him come to them, that much he understood. If he died, they'd find another keeper. That cold winter day, his belly dragging in the dirt, he had discovered once and for all who was master and who was slave. Not that there had ever been any real doubt. When Matthias crawled within reach of her arms, Wither had offered him succor as always. But he had sensed her amusement to see him laid so low, weak as a rut of the litter kitten, silent tears streaming down his leathery cheeks as he begged for the one thing only the witches could give him. That had been the last time he tried to break free of his servitude. Freedom, he knew, would only come in death, and death for him, as it had been for his father, Warren, and for his grandfather, Ezekiel, before him, would be a long time coming. Of course, he could always end his extended life prematurely, take his father's way out, with a bullet through the roof of his mouth, but Matthias had never had the conviction of spirit to put an end to his part in the witch's century-long legacy of evil. It was a small but essential part he played, and once a month he would be reminded of what they could give him for his service. Once a month made all the other days bearable. He carried his old blood-stained shovel into the barn with him. Sometimes they would make him work first. Other times he could sidle right up to them and have done with it. Usually they were contrary, so bringing the shovel, appearing ready for his gory chores, was his casual bit of insurance that they wouldn't taunt him first. It also wouldn't do to have the need so full upon him that he walked hunched over with the consuming ache of it. If they saw him on the edge of suffering, they'd take great pleasure in drawing it out, make him wait until the pain was truly exquisite and he was ready to drop to his knees and whimper for release. This time he chose his time well. Near dusk was, he knew from long years of experience, the safest time to disturb them. With the approach of dusk, they began to stir from their daylight sleep, so were less likely to lash out at sudden movements and sounds. And it would still be too early for them to be full of their cunning spitefulness and dangerous rages. He could expect to find them as docile and amiable as they ever were, especially now that their Eve had arrived. They would be most powerful and destructive now, leading up to midnight. Tomorrow would involve a hellish cleanup if his long years of experience were worth a damn. Sarah and Rebecca sat hunched in the deepest shadows, the farthest corners, deferring the vanguard position to Wither. They appeared as large, textured lumps to him, their occasional languid movements almost eel-like, serpentine as they unfolded their limbs in welcome to the night. Matthias stopped about 6 feet from the folded bulk of Wither, standing within reach of her long arms, as she demanded, but distant enough to be respectful. Even squatting, she was almost as tall as he was. Her eyes were open, mere yellow slits, but completely aware of him, he was sure, despite her apparent lethargy. "The need is upon me," he said without preamble. Wither stirred, her arms unfolding, reaching out toward him. So there would be no games this day, no taunting. He laid the shovel carefully at his feet and stepped forward, afraid to say anything that might change her relatively good mood. She pricked the tips of her index and middle fingers with a curved thumbnail, releasing a trickle of dark blood. After nearly a century and a half, Matthias could smell it on the air, and the scent unhinged his arthritic knees. He fell before her, pulling the fingertips into his mouth, sucking on the strange blood that coursed through the witch's veins. It satisfied 100 needs within him, and hinted at 100 more, secret pleasures forever out of reach, but endlessly tantalizing. Soon came the realization he was no longer with Wither. From where he lay, on a stale pile of straw clotted with fresh clumps of shit, he guessed she had tossed him bodily across the barn. He had been too lost in the rush of pleasure to notice the passage of time, the pain of his twisted arm, or the sickly sweet smell of her feces. He rolled over, climbed to his hands and knees, and retrieved his shovel. Wither had leapt up into the loft and completely ignored him now. Just as well, since he had work to do. He brought the wheelbarrow he kept by the door over to the remains of the first corpse and shoveled the one-eyed head in first. Generally, they ate the internal organs and most of the thighs. The rest they left scattered around the barn for Matthias to find in what amounted to a grotesque parody of a scavenger hunt. His wheelbarrow was soon overflowing with the remains of 3 different corpses, one of them female, wearing the tattered remains of a Danfield College t-shirt, which he would burn later. Wendy dreams she is alone in the dark, on the verge of sleep or just arising from a deep sleep. Without moving, she can tell she is in a confined place. The air is stale and earthly. Her eyes are staring, wide, but there is nothing to see. She reaches out with her hands, feels wood at her sides and wood above her, inches from her face. Her legs move and strike wood as well. She is confined within a wooden box. Not a box, a coffin. She has been buried alive. Wendy wants to scream, but Wither will not allow it. Wither remembers. This is where she is supposed to be. Listen. And she does. Her ears are hypersensitive to her breathing, to her heartbeat, frighteningly sluggish, to the steady chuff coming to her from above. She has been waiting for just such a sound. The chuff chuff from above, just as she expects. Wendy bites down on Wither's lip, fighting the urge to moan. Soon, Wither seems to promise her. Very soon now. The chuff becomes a thud as the shovel strikes the lid of the coffin. In minutes, the thuds become more urgent. The coffin lid vibrates and dust sifts down on her face. She blinks her eyes to free them from the dust. Then she hears a squeak as the coffin lid lifts slightly. Then it bangs shut again, slipping free of the numb fingers that pull against it. The momentary blast of fresh air revives Wither slightly. She breathes deeply of it. The lid raises again, more carefully this time, and she sees a sliver of moon, a sprinkling of stars, then the sweaty face of Ezekiel Stone looking down at her, fear expanding the whites of his eyes. The shovel falls from his hand. It is one thing to be told to dig up a coffin, quite another to actually find a live body waiting for you under the ground. "You live," Ezekiel Stone says. "Of course I live, Ezekiel," Wither says. "You would do well to remember that. I do not die easily." I live only to serve. Then help me out of here and dig up the others quickly, she says. They are bound to be more excitable than I at having been entombed. Wither stands there as Ezekiel digs up the graves that have been placed on either side of hers. As she imagined, she can gradually hear each of the other women, first Sarah, then Rebecca, moaning softly under their cold blankets of wood and dirt. As Wither waits for her blood sisters to be disinterred, she makes plans for their future together. First, they will need a place to sleep their long sleep, close to Ezekiel and his property. He and his descendants will keep them safe while the coven fall into their century-long stupor. And each time they arise to feed, she and her sisters will be further along the course away from human form. Sarah will be a perfect coven sister, strong enough, Wither hopes, to weather the changes in their life cycle. Others in the past have not always fared well, and Wither has had to put them down. No, Sarah will be fine, but what of Rebecca? Only time will tell. The child she conceived while human will remain inside her, may be reclaimed into her flesh. Its life ended in the jail cell when they joined blood, became coven. Will Rebecca be able to forget the child she will never bear? Will her mind, precariously balanced as it is, stand the test of centuries? Only time will tell. Right now she just waits impatiently to greet her sisters, her coven. Their cycle has begun. At 7:30, Art emerged from his hiding place in the vinyl archives, starving and stiff, and went foraging. He was alone in the radio station. WDAN was broadcasting pre-recorded programming all evening, since it was always impossible to find student DJs willing to take a Halloween shift. As Art went in search of the stale granola bars he recalled he'd kept stashed in his office, he heard Frankie Leonard's pre-recorded Sisters in Song playing. No granola bars. He wandered down to Studio A, where he hit pay dirt, a half-eaten bag of nacho chips, and a fully loaded Pez dispenser. He said a silent prayer of thanks to the DJ who had ignored the station's no food and drink policy. He plopped down heavily in the studio chair and wondered where Abby was hiding out in the darkness, and if she felt as alone right now as he did. He lifted his sneakered feet and pushed off the console to give himself some spin. The chair spun like an LP at something less than 33 1/3 speed, and he had a dizzy view of the swirling studio. Console, old sofa, Venetian blinds, cork walls, console, old sofa. There was a face at the window, upside down and looking in. A monster's face. The window imploded as Art's chair tipped out from under him and he crashed backward, flailing at the consoles. The face at the window was 3 times human size and dark as scorched hide. It bellowed at him, thrashing in the window frame. The Venetian blinds clacked and tangled as the thing fought to get at Art. Art picked up his swivel chair, hurled it at the creature in the window. The chair hit the furious black shape tangled in blinds and seemed to only enrage it further. It struggled to wrestle its bulk in through the narrow window. Art scurried backward beneath the console, cowering among the jungle of wires. From the studio speakers he heard Frankie Leonard saying, "Next we've got Elastica with Stutter. You know, I'm still waiting for a follow-up to their 1995 album." If he could only get to the phone on the wall. Wham! As if anticipating Art's thought, the creature in the window swung a massive arm through the air, sweeping 2 stacked CD players off the console and tearing the wall-mounted phones free. Wham! The claw punched through the ceiling. Chips of acoustical tile came down in a feathery rain. If it managed to hit the console again, it would destroy the equipment broadcasting the pre-recorded programs. Was anyone listening? Would anyone notice the dead air and send help? The console. Suddenly, Art realized he had the means to make the biggest fucking 911 call in history directed overhead. The thing in the window bellowed. The cinder blocks of the outer wall began cracking under the enormous pressure. Art took a breath, slid out from beneath the console, ducked to avoid the claw that thrust out to grasp at him. He punched a switch to kill the pre-recording, grabbed the studio mic. The sign mounted over the door winked red. On air. Jesus Christ, someone help me! It's almost... He was screaming into the mic. The creature in the window glared, furious that he was just outside its lethal reach. It's almost inside! Someone, please hurry! He saw the output needle on 1 meter bobbing in time with his crazed syllables, and wondered again if anyone was listening. Frankie Leonard had brought a Walkman with her as she walked downtown to watch Wendell's celebrated street festival, because she wanted periodically throughout the night to check out the Sisters in Song show she'd pre-recorded yesterday. At a little past 7 o'clock, as she waited for Tyrannosaurus Sex to pack up their trombones and switch out their drum kit for the next band, she slipped on her headphones in time to catch the weird disembodied sound of her own voice. Next, we've got Elastica with Stutter. You know, I'm still waiting for a follow-up to their 1995 album. Geez, did she really sound that phony and annoying? She couldn't take it. She snatched the headphones off. On stage, Tackhammer's lead singer, Brian, said into the mic, "Can I get more monitor?" He looked out across the crowd, forlorn, sleepy-eyed. "Someone? Anyone?" Frankie studied him critically from her position below the stage, his head of unwashed curls in stark silhouette against the increasingly cloudy night sky. Her opinion of Brian, like her opinion of men in general, remained conflicted. Just look at this guy. He's a total indie cliché, with his Salvation Army bowling shirt and his bad posture and a bleary expression that said he'd only woken up 20 minutes ago on the sofa in the practice place in front of a return of Barney Miller. All of his songs were ironic little odes to television and convenience stores and how exhausting it was to work up the strength to kiss a girl, sung through a repressed yawn. And yet, sweet Jesus, he was hot. Okay, so it wasn't her fault. She was genetically programmed to respond to a guy with a guitar. You didn't have to be Desmond Morris to understand that a guitar was just an enormous throbbing electrified penis wired for sound. Brian leaned into the microphone again and said, I really could use a little more monitor up here." It seemed like Tackhammer was having a few technical difficulties, so Frankie took the opportunity to check in on herself and Sisters in Song yet again, disproving Grimace at the ready. She slipped the headphones up to her ears. "Fuck, shit, piss, cocksucker, help me!" Behind the profane hysteria, it sort of sounded like Art Leeson, the fugitive station manager. "Jesus Christ, somebody fucking help me!" Then a loud crash followed by static. Dead air. What was that? Some kind of War of the Worlds Halloween prank? No, Frankie thought, feeling her chest tighten in fear. That was real terror in Art's voice. She turned from the pavilion and waded into the crowd. She forced her way through the human tide, pushing aside kids with painted faces, sorority sisters dressed as prostitutes, how original, old couples with chemically glowing bangles and necklaces. Frankie spied a young deputy struggling hard to play the part of a police presence. He didn't look very confident in his uniform. It might as well have been a costume, but he was wearing a real enough sidearm, and she was sure he had a car nearby. She ran to him. The monster was inside the studio. The console exploded in a shower of sparks as she tore it free of the wall to get at her prey. But Art was gone. He'd abandoned the flimsy shelter of the console only moments before, after a feeble attempt to remember all 7 of the 7 dirty words of the FCC forbade from broadcasting. He was backing down the hallway now into darkness. Listening to the destruction going on in the studio, the creature was creating a real light show of sparks and flame as she destroyed Studio A. Art wasn't sure exactly when he'd begun thinking of the monster as she, but he was as certain of the monster's gender now as he was of his own. Despite the horrific proportions of her arms, the distorted nightmare of her face, there was something distinctly female about her. Crash! The wall of the studio collapsed, spilling mortar dust and cinder block rubble into the corridor. Art backed away a little faster, then turned, running deeper into the labyrinth. He only paused long enough to seize a fire extinguisher, the nearest heavy object he could find. He heard the monster enter the corridor behind him, so big she nearly filled it. She swung her fisted claws from side to side, smashing craters in the corridor walls. As he ran, Art felt bits of cinder block shrapnel sting the back of his head. In the confined space of the narrow corridors, Art had the advantage of his smaller size. He cut a sharp right, tripping headlong over a box of CD jewel cases someone had left in the dark. He spilled forward, hit hard, scrambled back. She loomed over him, bellowing. He felt her pin him down with one claw as she brought her face in close to his. He shut his eyes, expecting a quick, violent death, then opened them again when it didn't come. She cocked her enormous head at him, unmistakably a gesture of human curiosity. Her lips curled back from a vulpine snarl. She clumped a claw around his head, holding it like a melon, and sniffed him. Her eyes narrowed to slits as she turned his head left and right, her expression one of bafflement. She sniffed the bandana and the injured eye beneath. A scream. The monster whipped her head around, instantly alert. Frankie and Deputy Reed Davis stood several yards back in the corridor. The deputy had his firearm drawn and began wincing as he squeezed off shots. 6 in rapid succession, deafening concussions in the confined space. The monster roared as the bullets struck her. Art took advantage of her momentary distraction and emptied the fire extinguisher into her face, blinding her temporarily with chemical foam. She reared back, furious, and he scrambled out between her legs. The monster turned and staggered after them in blind pursuit, thrashing. The deputy lingered a split second too long, emptying his gun into her. As she passed, she slammed him into the cinder block wall, crushing his rib cage. She lumbered past, bellowing at the fleeing Art and Frankie. Deputy Reed Davis slid down the wall slowly in a slick of his own gore, landing in a seated thump, splayed-legged like a broken marionette. Frankie and Art ran hand in hand through WDAN's narrow hallways, fleeing the nightmare. They burst through the station's front doors and dashed across the short lawn to the deputy's patrol car, its engine idling. Inside the station, the witch roared as she struggled to wedge through the tight doorframe, seeing her prey escape in a blaze of headlights and a spray of gravel. Wendy awoke, huddled in her bed, shivering with a phantom fever. Her throat felt sore. From thirst, she thought initially, but soon realized it was an external ache. Her hands went to her neck and found abrasions there. She ran to the bathroom mirror and discovered the abrasions were ligature marks circling her throat, all the way around to the nape of her neck, as if someone had tried to strangle her while she slept. Not strangled, she realized, hanged. Wendy's recollection of the official events was sketchy at best, but she recalled that the Wendell witches had been hanged several years after the Salem hysteria had come and gone. That had been the extent of Wendell's brush with witchcraft, but her dreams told a different story, a story where documented history and the facts parted company at the gallows. Wither and her coven had cheated the hangman's noose. They had even been buried in some sort of death-like sleep or trance, waiting for the gravedigger to come along. Could any of this really be true, or was Wendy losing her mind? Witches with black blood and clawed fingernails? Was that part of the pact with the devil aspect of black magic and sorcery? She rubbed some of her mother's skin lotion all over the red marks circling her neck, soothing the dry burning sensation, and returned to her bedroom. What did the Wendell witches, who had lived 300 years ago, have to do with what was happening to Karen and her today? The dreams, the fatigue, the gray hair, and now these strange ligature marks. Were they being haunted? Had the witches placed a curse on Wendell? Wendy looked down at her aching legs. I'm losing all control of my mind and my body. Then a chilling thought. At night I dream her dreams, and in the daylight she takes a walk in my skin. After checking that there had been no change in Alex's condition, Wendy went into the bathroom and prepared a purifying bath of lavender and thyme. She climbed into the steaming water, wearing her crystal necklace in the hope it would clear her mind. She lay back, her arms along the edge of the bathtub, head resting against the sloped back as the hot water eased her aching body. She imagined floating on a peaceful sea with no worries. Floating. Floating over Colonial Wendell. No, flying. Fly agaric toadstools, body grease enabling witches to fly, on broomsticks made from the wood of ash trees. Flying, just like in my dreams. Wendy imagined the tales of flying were based on accounts of astral projection. Most of the Salem convictions had been based on spectral evidence. That is, the accusers said they saw the witches' specters, astral projections, leaving their bodies to do the accusers harm. Right in the courtroom where everybody could see, but everyone hadn't seen. Only the accusers saw the specters of the witches on trial. When the spectral evidence was disallowed in Salem, The convictions ended. Never sufficient evidence of witchcraft to hang another accused witch in Salem. That hadn't been the case in Wendell. The Wendell witches were found guilty of the practice of witchcraft, but had been convicted on damning evidence of murders. Wendy sat up a little straighter in the tub with a simple but frightening thought. What if Wither and her coven had been more than murderesses? What if they had been real witches? Not secretive midwives or medicine women, mixing herbs and making foul-smelling poultices, but genuine black magic practicing, card-carrying evil witches, like the ones all the fairy tales warned us about, the ones who made poisoned apples, cast malicious spells, and had an unsavory taste for the flesh of children. Her mother knocked on the bathroom door. "Wendy? Frankie is here to see you. She seems quite distraught." 5 minutes later, Wendy emerged from her house, dressed in black jeans and a cable-knit sweater, her hair still dripping wet. Frankie was pacing in tight little circles and muttering to herself. "Jesus, Frankie, what's wrong?" At the sight of Wendy, Frankie flew into her friend's arms and began sobbing. Wendy held her tight and smoothed her blonde hair, saying, "Are you hurt? Did something happen?" "I saw it, Wendy," Frankie said, just this side of hysteria. "God, I really saw it." "What did you see?" The thing that took Jack. The monster Jen Hoyt's been drawing in class. That," Wendy cut her off. "Where?" "The radio station." As she said it, Frankie seemed to remember something. "Come on, I brought someone else who saw it too." She clutched at Wendy's sleeve and drew her down the driveway toward the street. "Wait, Frankie, where are we going? What? Please, no questions, just come with me." Wendy followed Frankie off the mansion grounds and up the sidewalk. 2 blocks away, parked in the deep shadows of an elm, was a police car, and there was someone inside. Wendy stopped short. "You came here in that?" Frankie nodded emphatically, jumpy, nerves fried. "I didn't want to freak out your folks, so we parked out here. The deputy was killed. It killed him." "Killed? Then who's in that car?" Wendy felt her hackles rise as the passenger door opened and the haggard stranger came forward from the shadows. He looked like an escaped mental patient, a paisley bandana over one eye, face covered in fresh scratches. Wendy thought at first his hair was entirely gray, then realized it was covered in plaster dust. His shirt looked like it had been tie-dyed in blood. "This is Art," Frankie said, "from the radio station." She turned to Art and said, "Wendy knows about these things. She's a witch." "Why do you think it came after you?" Wendy asked Art. "I don't know," he said. "I think it's the same thing that killed my brother last night. It might have been trying to get to his girlfriend, Karen." "Glazier?" Wendy said, a cold lump of dread in the pit of her stomach. "Professor Karen Glazier?" Art nodded. "I took her to the hospital before it could come back for her. I think maybe that's why it's pissed off at me." He looked Wendy up and down, obviously reconceiving his notion of what a witch looked like. "Do you know what it is?" Wendy looked down at her hands, realized she was rubbing her thumb raw against her fingernails. The nails were dark, coarsened, inhuman. What was she becoming? The witches in the jail cell. The dream was finally coming into focus, the mingling of blood. "Better than that," Wendy said. "I know who she is." Art and Frankie looked at her in surprise as she told them. "Rebecca Cole." "The Wendell witch?" Art shook his head, trying to process what Wendy had just said. "As in the infamous Wendell 3? But she was hanged. It's in all the town records of the period. Hanged, buried, and then dug up again. She survived her reported death. Trust me, I've seen it. Or actually dreamt it." Frankie said, "But the thing we saw wasn't human." "She's 300 years old," Wendy said. "She's getting a little long in the tooth." Frankie shook her head, struggling to understand. "Wendy, if this monster, this Rebecca Cole, has been around for 300 years, how come no one's ever seen it before?" "Good question." Wendy was about to admit she didn't know when Art provided the answer. "Someone has." All eyes turned to him. He seemed to be a little surprised himself, as if he'd just realized the explanation. "Every 100 years during the last October before a century's end. It's the Wendell curse. Just look back at the historical records." Wendy nodded. "They must undergo some sort of dormancy period." "They?" Art repeated, the blood draining from his face. "It only makes sense," Wendy said. "There has to be more than one of them." "How do you know?" Art asked. "Because a different one is after me. Just like Rebecca Cole has targeted Karen," Wendy said, feeling a sick lurch in her stomach as she said it aloud for the first time. "Elizabeth Wither is after me." She began speaking aloud again, as much to herself as to Frankie and Art. Wither is the leader of their coven. She recruited the other two. Wendy's eyes unfocused and her voice fell to a whisper. She spoke as if from a great distance. She made them drink her blood, then infected their blood with hers, so they would become different, just like her. Art recalled something he'd seen on a plaque once in Wendell's Witch Museum, a detail he'd never granted any significance. The other two were young, Rebecca Cole and Sarah Hutchins, born here in the colonies, but Wither arrived late to the community. Whatever she was, or is, she brought it from the old world, like a plague. His words brought Wendy back into focus. She met Art's eyes, the two strangers united suddenly in a moment of mutual understanding. It was Frankie who finally interrupted with the simplest of questions. If Rebecca Cole is after Professor Glazer and Wither is after Wendy, then what about the third witch? Sarah Hutchins, Art whispered, and felt his throat tighten as he flashed back in that instant to a hospital room in the pediatric intensive care unit. Abby McNeil. Who? Frankie asked. An 8-year-old. I found her sleeping on Sarah Hutchins' grave in the woods. The witch must have kidnapped her from the hospital last night. He flashed Wendy a desperate look. The police think I snatched her. Wendy said, So you're the fugitive they've been looking for. Art caught Wendy's arm. Do you think the little girl is still alive somewhere? What does Sarah want from her? Wendy held up a lock of her prematurely graying hair. The same thing Wither wants from me. Frankie looked at Wendy's drawn face, eyes ringed with dark circles. She's doing this to you, isn't she? Wendy's hand went to her cheek, found a new line there. Draining me. Why? Frankie asked, horrified. Wendy shrugged. Sapping our life force, energy, whatever you want to call it, draining us like batteries. How much longer? Frankie began to say, and let the thought trail away. She touched 2 fingers to Wendy's face. It ends tonight, Wendy said. One way or another. It's the biggest magical night on the calendar. Wendy felt her knees go soft and gave into it, sitting on the curb, turned to Art. You saw it yourself. The curse is an October phenomenon. That means by midnight all 3 of us will be drained dry. Karen, Abby, me. She looked up at Frankie and Art, standing to either side of her. Her expression hardened, eyes narrowing. At least that's what Wither would like to think. You think you can stop this? Art asked. I tried once before, but I didn't know all the facts and I failed. Now I know just what I'm up against. Wendy stood suddenly, determined. I think it's time to write a new ending to this fairy tale. 20 minutes later they separated, Art cruising off in the deputy's patrol car with the headlights off, Wendy returning inside with Frankie in tow to make preparations for battle. Throughout, Wendell's jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porch steps, while paper skeletons waved from parlor windows. Downtown, the King Frost Parade had spilled outside the boundaries of the square and into side streets. As the hour grew later, the costumed crowd grew rowdier with alcohol and adrenaline, seething now with something slightly feral as the clock crawled toward the witching hour. There was no police now to control them. The sheriff had departed moments earlier in response to a panicked radio call from Deputy Sheriff Schaefer, something about WDAN radio station and an officer down. At 11 p.m., Mayor Del Oleo felt something hard ping him on the top of his head. He pulled off his rubber Ted Kennedy mask and searched for the offending projectile, and saw it bounce off through the crowd. A golf ball? Then the turbulent skies opened and the hail began. It's coffee time for the last time because the last chapter, chapter 10, is about to begin.